Each month, we come forward to discuss in collaboration with ID Mentors on various trending topics in L&D space. Welcome to Learning, Experience, and Design podcast series. The L.E.A.D Podcast Series. This is Sandeep Kumar, the founder of LXD Guild community. Hello, very good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. Welcome to the L.E.A.D Podcast Series, the Learning, Experience, and Design podcast series. Your one-stop shop for insights on the ever-evolving world of learning and development. So we have our host for this podcast, Purnima Valiathan. Purnima Valiathan is the co-founder and creative head of ID Mentors. So hi Purnima, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being the host for this podcast series.
Our guest in this episode is Clark Quinn. Clark Quinn is a world-renowned learning experience design strategist. He has over 4 decades of experience in the design, development, and evaluation of educational technologies. He is also a prolific speaker and author. Clark is known for creating award-winning solutions for learning and performance support. He has written several influential books on learning and was honored as the E-Learning Guild's first Guild Master in 2012. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Quinnovation, Co-Director of the Learning Development Accelerator, and Chief Learning Strategist at Upside Learning. Good evening from India, Clark. Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast series. And I think I'll get started with the questions. I'm really, very glad that you agreed to join us, speak to us. We in India, the ID community, the L&D community would really gain a lot from your thoughts and your experience, which you'll share tonight with us tonight in India. But it's morning for Clark over there. Yeah. So thank you very much, Clark, once again, and I'll get started. So my first question to you, Clark, and I will put these questions in the Indian context, the Indian instructional design context. So before I ask the question, what I want to say is that in India, instructional designers do not have, many of them don't have a background in learning or education or instructional design. Most of them become instructional designers, almost by default. And then they are trained on the job. So what happens is that, and I have been one such person myself, but I have a background in education. So I have a master's degree in education and I kind of transitioned into instructional design. And when I joined, we were trained on frameworks, methodologies, models, if I may say so, the how of training, learning design, etc. And very little was spoken about the why or the science behind it. Right. So, and if some instructional designers happen to pick it up on their own, it added to their knowledge. But if they didn't, then they just did things using templates, formats, standards, and and to a large extent this continues to be the same now. This is 25 years hence that we're talking about. There are some courses on instructional design, but very few and scattered. And for some reason, companies pick people with writing skills, English majors or engineering students, and then train them. So my question, Clark, to you is that how important is it for instructional designers to understand learning science, have a foundation in learning science?
Thank you for characterizing that, and welcome to to the audience. I obviously care passionately about doing good learning design, and I think it's critical to understand how humans learn because we have, for 2 major reasons. One is there are a lot of folk psychology about how we learn and a lot of experience with schools that actually aren't really well aligned with how our brains learn. And the second thing is it leaves us vulnerable to myths that persist, learning styles, generations, attention span of a goldfish. These are a bunch of things that people continue to believe that aren't accurate. And too often, if you just come in and do what you're told, you're very dependent upon the beliefs of the people training you. And they may not have a good learning science background. I'm aware that in India, an instructional design program just didn't exist for maybe up until recently. But I've done a fair amount of work with Indian organizations on learning, and it's clear that that the beliefs are wrong. So learning science, understanding that gives you the ability to do also a couple of things. And one is to design accurately and what doesn't work so you can avoid those. A couple examples. So we know that we shouldn't just test knowledge and expect that to lead to a change in behavior. We should know that. Learning science knows that. And yet too often we see requests for people to just put up content and add a knowledge test question and think that that addresses a learning need. We have very good evidence that doesn't work, but if you don't know the learning science behind it, you might think, well, that's like school, so it will work, right? And people don't realize how badly school didn't really work for learning any meaningful skills unless you were at a trade school. So I think it's critical to know, and it unpacks. It can go many decades I've been looking at this. I keep finding new things that unpack, but that's okay. You don't have to start with that. We have really good guidelines if you pay attention to learning science. I did with Michael Allen, one of the really OG of e-learning. He created the authoring environment, Authorware. He's now running Allen Interactions. So Julie Dirksen, who worked for him, has written the fabulous books Designed for How People Learn and Now Talk to the Elephant. Will Thalheimer, who is one of our gurus of research translation, and myself, we're walking around a conference and going, there's so much new shiny stuff and nothing of substance has changed. It's still wrong. And so we wrote the Serious E-Learning Manifesto over a decade ago. It didn't have the impact we wanted, but it talked about the difference between typical e-learning and serious e-learning that actually is going to have an impact. And you can go there and sign up and nobody expects you to change everything you do right away, but start making small moves towards it. Those differences between what works and what doesn't are based on learning science. And yet too often we see too much still typical e-learning instead of e-learning that's really going to make a difference. And you can't know that if you don't know the learning science that drives behind it and tells you why these things are important.
Yeah. Thank you, Clark, for that detailed explanation. And I hope our viewers and listeners will take a cue from this and brush up on their learning science. And I would recommend all the instructional designers in India to buy Clark Quinn's book on learning science. It's simple. It's not too huge. It's yes. I have it here too. Also full of practical examples. And, you can just teach yourself by going through that book. So please do. If you haven't already got a copy of that book, please do buy that book. Right. And yes, Clark, as you said, folk psychology, myths, they continue, and one of the best ways, as you said, to address that is to have a strong understanding of learning science. And yes, that brings me to the second question. And I'll also pick up a little response that you gave in the first question to ask my second question. You mentioned something about, testing for knowledge is not going to, help a learner to apply it. Yet we see a lot of that in a lot of online courses. Right. And again, the concept of, rehearsal, elaboration, and retrieval. I hope I have that in order because you corrected me over there once. So rehearsal, elaboration, and retrieval are ways in which we learn things. We commit it to long-term memory. And again, one is learning about frameworks, models, and methodologies. The second thing that most IDs in India do is follow standards. So there will be the standards document that says include a question after every 5 to 7 frames or screens. So, you have the instructional designer insert a question, which is a recall question completely. And it's just being taught. So there's also a recency factor to it. So please, tell our viewers and listeners this whole concept of rehearsal, elaboration, and retrieval, and how that helps in the learning process.
Well, even before rehearsal is keeping things in short-term memory so that you have the ability to do the processing on them that helps move them into long-term memory. That's the elaboration. But before that, our attentional span is fairly small. It's not that it's limited in duration. You can lose attention. We have lots of distractions, these little devices and things, but, can also disappear for hours into games and novels and movies. And so that attention span myth isn't right. But what we do have is limited capacity. And so you need to chunk things up into small enough bits of new information that our minds can keep it in short-term memory, because we don't have long-term memory to draw upon that we've already compiled it away. So we rehearse it in short-term memory, but the important thing to do is to elaborate it, to reprocess it in different ways, asking people to do generative activities that say, what does this remind you? Connecting it to your previous knowledge. How does this build upon what you already know? So you ask these sorts of questions to get it into long-term memory. But so that's elaboration or generative activities. But then you also need retrieval practice. What we too often write, that's what most of our knowledge test questions are, asked us to retrieve the information. And sadly, people will pick arbitrary bits of information out of the content rather than figuring out what's important. And that makes a big difference. What we should do, and Pooja Agarwal did some really nice research where she had people do low-level questions or high-level questions. We've always had this belief that you need to have the low-level knowledge to be able to do the high-level performance. And that's true, but the high-level questions require you to retrieve that information and apply it. So you don't need the low-level questions. And that's what she demonstrated. If you just do the low-level questions, the knowledge test questions every 5, screens, they will be able to recite the knowledge, but they won't be able to use it. If you instead ask questions every 5 screens, it says, now use this to make this decision that's like the decision you have to make in the workplace. Suddenly, we're doing much better. And that's what her research found. If you ask the high-level questions, you get the ability to perform the high-level things afterwards. And the low-level questions don't add anything. So don't be asking. And so when you write multiple choice questions, which is most of what this knowledge test stuff is, you can instead write them as what I call mini scenarios. And that's just a situation where, and the alternatives are not different knowledge things. They're different decisions you make about applying that knowledge. So if you're learning something about negotiation, your decision means you can respond this way, or this way. If you're learning something about operations, should you process it this way or process it that way or process it that way? These are the decisions people need to make. That's the knowledge you want to test with the information you're presenting, and you should only presenting information that helps you make those decisions better, because that's what's going to make a difference to your organization, not the ability to recite knowledge. Editorial soapbox, if you being able to recite facts isn't what's going to make a difference to your organization. What's going to make the difference is the ability to make a better decision in an ambiguous and challenging environment. And that's what we humans do well. And that's what we should be helping our people know, that that's what they need to do, because then you're going to get the attention. They're going to be there going, oh, I do need this and I don't know it, and this will change that. But they're only going to do that if they recognize that the problems you're giving them are relevant. If you're dumping a bunch of knowledge, they're going to go, that knowledge doesn't help me. So kind of went far afield, but it's that whole process of elaborating information into terms of relating it to your existing knowledge and connecting it in richer and richer ways over time. By the way, what that elaboration and retrieval cycle doesn't emphasize is we can only strengthen those connections in our memory so much in any one day before that fatigues. I use the metaphor of going to the gym. If you go to the gym one day and really work out, are you going to suddenly be buff? Not really. You're going to have to go, and rest, and then come back 2 days later and 2 days later, and you should alternate, aerobic activities with weight activities and all this stuff. But it takes months. And the same thing with learning. Our brains can only strengthen the relationships a little bit each day. And then you need to literally let the mind rest and then reactivate it. Best to reactivate it when it's just about to be forgotten, but we can't predict that. So we should just pick some good intervals, 2 days and then 3 days and then 4 days and then every week of new information to be reactivated and retested. And that's what makes learning stick. And if you think about anything you do, not what you do for work, but for hobby, for passion, do you do crafts, or do you do sports? Do you do whatever other hobby you have? How did you learn that? You probably didn't learn it in one thing. You probably learned a little bit, and then you practiced and you got feedback and you went and watched somebody else and a whole bunch of things over time. And that's what learning science tells us. And that's what we should be building into our learning experiences. We absolutely need that elaboration and we need that retrieval practice, but we need that again and again over time. And together, that putting it in the long-term memory by elaborating it by generative activities and practicing and getting it back and making decisions in the ways we will need to. That's how we acquire the ability to make those decisions.
Thank you, Clark. So just to summarize, what I heard you saying is that it's important to test on high level stuff like decision making, which is elaboration, their generative activities. And if as a learner, I can answer that correctly, obviously I know the low level information. It's built into that. It's inbuilt into that. So it's better to have tests. That's one thing. The second thing was that gym metaphor. I mean, that's going to stay with me. Metaphors are such powerful learning tools. So the gym metaphor, you don't build your body by going to the gym in a single day. You keep doing it, going again and again and again, and over a period of time. And much of learning is the same. It happens the same way. So one online course in which I answer some questions within the course and as a final assessment is not going to do the job. There have to be opportunities for the learner to apply that over and over again over a period of time for learning to actually stick. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And feedback matters too. So you perform, but you get feedback. So don't just have the learning event. What matters is when they perform, what do they get as feedback? Right and wrong doesn't tell them what they did right or wrong. You need to reinforce that as well. I want to emphasize that point. And I want to make this tangible and concrete for people. So you take something, and I'm trying to pick something most people have some experience with, say project management and managing risk. And you say, instead of asking, is this a situation where you should apply this risk or this risk? You say, you're in this situation. Somebody comes up and you have to make a decision how to manage the risk. Do you accept say, go ahead and try that? Do you say, let's make sure we're careful? Do you do this? It's the alternatives choices in that question are choices of things to do, not asking you knowledge about risk management. It's asking you to make decisions using that knowledge to actually practice making risk management decisions. And it's a subtle but a very important distinction. And the problem is that well-written, well-designed, and well-produced e-learning doesn't look all that much different from just well-produced e-learning. And so if you're selling it, you're going to do what's cheaper and easier. But if you're the need to make an impact on your people, it really matters that you get that design right, not just the production.
Yeah. Thanks, Clark, for elaborating that with such a concrete example. I'm sure that made it a lot more easier for me as well as our listeners and viewers to understand the point that you're trying to make. My third question to you is with regard to media. I don't know if Donald Clark said it or he quoted Richard Meyer. He said, media rich is not necessarily mind rich. And that's something that when we were discussing over email, you stated a point about the cognitive role of media. And I would like you to explain that and elaborate on that. What do you mean by the cognitive role of media? And how do instructional designers apply that or use that understanding?
Well, so one of the things we see is video. Everybody's putting everything into video. There are times when video is great, but there are times when it actually interferes with learning. And I mentioned cognitive load and that limited cognitive attention. And if you're so overwhelmed by all the production and the fancy moving things and the voice, that may overwhelm. It's called extrinsic cognitive load. And John Sweller's research at the University of New South Wales has really sort of demonstrated that you can't have too much. And Ruth Clark, who's co-written books, The E-Learning and the Science of Instruction with Rich Mayer. Rich Mayer is a UC Santa Barbara professor who's looked at multimedia learning, media in particular. And she summarizes in the books the research that he has done into practical guidance. And it's things like, having the labels separate from the diagram make it harder to process because you have to keep jumping back and forth. This thing is that label, this thing is that label, instead of integrating it. And when you have too much, moving text accompanying the audio, then you're trying to read the text and watch the video at the same time. These things interfere with actual learning. Now, each media has cognitive principles. So I can talk about an image. There's a photo, like if we took a still image of you right now, as elegant as you look, that would be great for establishing context. But if I was trying to illustrate concept, the meaning behind something, I'd be much better off with a diagram because it takes the elements and the relationships between them and lays them out in space and makes them comprehensible. Depending on whether you're trying to communicate concept or context, diagrams, or if you need to capture the dynamics of it, of animation of things moving as opposed to video. But if you need the context, if you need to see actually how things change in the real world as a result of this, you absolutely want a video because you're communicating context. So the concept, the mental model, diagrams or animations. The context, you can use photos or video, but by the way, I'm separating out animation and video, and I'm talking about video being, actually filming what you're seeing as opposed to having things moving, cartoons or animated diagrams on the screen. That matters. And then there's text, which communicates underlying ideas, but you may use audio instead. Audio has really interesting properties. If you're already watching something, you shouldn't be trying to read and watch it. Kids put captions these days, but mostly because the dialogue is unintelligible or it's in a foreign language. But in general, you want to have the audio if it doesn't interfere. If you're in a workplace and there's audio and, you have to wear headphones or something so you're not disturbing your neighbor. And we can go off into all sorts of areas about the problems with open space working, but that's a digression. And audio has a really interesting property. And why do we have podcasts that we listen to while driving? And why do we have a GPS that speaks to us? It's because we shouldn't take our eyes off the road. Audio is non-directional. Video, our eyes have to be focused forward. So these are the properties that we need to balance. And then comics play an interesting thing about stripping away unnecessary context, but being able to layer on some of the concept behind it. And thought bubbles are really great for showing the underlying thinking, which is really important, it turns out. But the point is, and we can use different media. You can use a sequence of still photos with a narration to be the equivalent of video. That's what Ken Burns did with the Civil War series, right? I don't know if that was on television in India, but he's an artist and he had these photos from the Civil War and he would zoom in or zoom out on them, make them slightly dynamic, but they were still photos. And he just had a series of these, but then he had this narrative thread that tied it together and told stories over multiple episodes that conveyed the whole experience of the Civil War in very powerful and ways. So we want variety, but not for learning styles, but to increase the likelihood of finding a representation that matches a useful way to think about it. So we can use analogy. A bad analogy, by the way, that we used to have was, electrons circling the nucleus is like planets circulating around a sun. It turns out that was wrong because that's not a good metaphor for how electrons travel. There's probabilistic cloud around the nucleus instead. But a good analogy, like the flow of electricity in circuits is like the flow of water in pipes. That actually can give us some useful inferences that allow us to make good decisions. Like if you have the circuit compromise, that's like having a leak in the pipe. You're leaking essentially the electricity into the environment, which can be dangerous, as can water if it mistaken. So anyways, the point being, we want to use the right media to communicate. We may use variety beyond that to maintain interest, but help people get the core right, know when to use the media, and don't overload it because, again, all those fancy pictures accompanying the idea can overload your ability to process and focus on the important thing. And so minimalism is an important principle. Media rich doesn't mean knowledge rich, to Donald Clark's point, because media rich can be overwhelming the cognitive message. I'm stopped there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Some very good points. Understand the media properties, understand that too much media can distract and overwhelm. It causes an additional load on your working memory, resources which are limited. Understand the context, the concept, what is it that you are explaining, and use the right media appropriately. Not everything needs to be a video, not everything needs to be an animation. When you need to show something that is animated in real life, or like a process or something, then go for animation. Basically, guess, use the right media when you are teaching something. Understand what you're teaching, what's important in that, and select media carefully, because too much media does not mean great learning.
I love the way you summarize the things I say and restate them. Really useful. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So now my fourth question, and this is something I connect with very personally. So I had never gone to a typing class ever. I never learned typing. And suddenly I landed this job in an IT company as an instructional designer, and I had to use computers, keyboard. And initially, obviously, I would search for the letters on the keyboard. But over a period of time, didn't even realize that my fingers were automatically going to the right letters. I'm sure I don't have the speed of a person who's actually learned typing in a professional setting, but I still can do it. And it was an almost like an aha moment for me, as I thought about it a lot, and I said that I never learned typing consciously, but I still learned it. I never learned typing formally, but I still learned it. And the conscious part is more important over here, because we are coming to this question of all learning does not happen in the head, right? So I'm not sure whether I'm right to say about this example. This didn't actually happen in my head. I didn't sit and keep practicing okay, Q, W, T and all that. I didn't. But over a period of time, my fingers go to the right letters when I'm typing something. So please shed some light on that. The statement that not all learning happens in the head.
So I took a job programming for a living, and I'd never taken a typing class either. Although I did put a forcing function on. At that time we used little TVs, which probably made my eyes go bad prematurely. And I deliberately didn't look at the keyboard. I made mistakes and I fixed them, and I forced myself to learn exactly what you did. I actually can type pretty fast now, and I write a fair amount. I did learn a reliable mistake though. I'm continually trying to hit the B key with my right hand when I should be using my left hand. That's because it was convenient enough and it worked that I did it. And yet that means I can't use a split keyboard, because I would constantly misuse the wrong thing unless I force myself, and it would be better ergonomically, but my bad habits would suddenly slow me down considerably. But we can learn things. What David Geary's research showed was about biologically primary versus biologically secondary stuff. And typing, despite the keyboard layout, by the way, and my PhD advisor studied this and I learned it as well, was designed to slow you down, because it didn't want you hitting letters that were next to one another where they struck. So they kept experimenting, and the QWERTY keyboard isn't the most effective. Arguably, the Dvorak is a better keyboard, but very few keyboards have it. And by the time they went from physical typewriters to electronic digital computers, the keyboard had already won, the QWERTY keyboard. And so the cost to change is more than it would be good to do. But nonetheless, motor stuff we can learn pretty well. It's the cognitive stuff that's more challenging. And what Geary pointed out, certain things we're wired to learn. Speaking and listening are two things that are essential to sort of human nature. Reading and writing using the same language weren't. And it turns out they're very hard to learn. and they don't naturally acquire, you have to actually have instruction. And what he showed is that certain things we're wired to learn to do well, and that includes certain physical things, and you forced yourself to learn it, may not have been the most efficient. If you'd taken a typing class, you might have gotten faster quicker and ended up overall faster. Same for me.
Yes.
But you
Yes.
can learn things, most things. We do seem to have mental barriers against nonlinear things, and we struggle with the randomness. We are continually trying to make explanations, and when things are random, we create myths about why things are this way instead of accepting them. But his argument is, and I think it's plausible, John Sweller has accepted as well, I mentioned him earlier, that's why we have instruction, is to learn things that we wouldn't naturally acquire quickly, let alone maybe at all. So we can learn things just by feedback from the world. It probably started cognitively, and then the power law of learning that Alan Newell documented, and people like Ramahart Normal have talked about, accretion, restructuring, and tuning as processes that can happen, but instruction helps accelerate that. And again, maybe some things we wouldn't be able to learn at all if not for instruction, because we just would never see the patterns. Our brains aren't wired to see certain types of patterns that emerge. So yes, you could learn to type. And yes, it might have been faster if you'd taken a typing class where they gave you exercises specifically to help accelerate your speed of doing it. And the same would have been true for me. But we do have reasons why instruction matters. Those good practices help us learn it faster, and for our organization, or at all, and for our organizations, that matters. And that's why we should care about good instructional design, not just throwing people in and giving them feedback. They might learn it eventually, but one of the other problems is if we create a story about how the world works and it turns out not to be accurate, we don't say, please, sir, may I have another model? We instead patch our pre-existing model and patch it. We end up with this patched together thing that's still not accurate. We're very resistant to throw it out and accept a new one. So giving people good models to begin with is a much more efficient approach. And that's, again, why instruction matters, as well as choosing the right examples, the right context of examples to help facilitate people transferring to all the appropriate situations. If you do a whole bunch of negotiating with vendor training in your negotiation course, but you never do negotiating with customers, when you're negotiating with a customer, none of that may transfer. But if you've given contextual practice on negotiating with vendors, negotiating with customers, negotiating with your children, you're not supposed to do that, but you do anyways, etc., you're much more likely to abstract and generalize the negotiation tactics that then can be applied in many more situations.
Yeah, thanks for that. The highlight for me, and I'm sure for our listeners and viewers, is the fact that there are some things that we learn, like listening and speaking, and some things which are difficult to learn, like reading and writing. And that's where instruction, especially and specifically good instruction, really matters. Yes, we all will learn, like I took the typing example, but I'm not an efficient typist, if I may use the word. Had I attended classes, maybe I would have been much faster and more efficient, right? So that's where, as you said, good instruction matters. Right? Yeah. So I come to the next question, which is again something that I really think a lot about: emotion and cognition. I mean, I do know that if you're anxious, for instance, it's difficult to learn something in that state of mind. If you're bored with something, again, it's difficult to learn in that mental space. So, would you have some insights on how emotion impacts the learning process?
Yeah. I held up my learning science book earlier, and I intended this as a complement to it.
I
Make it
see.
meaningful, a whole book just on this topic, because I think it's so important. And we actually now these days have a fair amount of books about the learning science side, including mine and others. There's lots of good ones. But when you look at the emotion side, there hasn't been that much said about it. And I think it's really important. And we have evidence that it's important. To your point, exactly. If you're bored, learning's not going to happen. If you don't believe that this is important for you, learning's really not going to happen. You may go through the motions and do something, but it'll dissipate really quickly. That'll dissipate really quickly, possibly anyways, unless you reinforce it. But people aren't open. I have this sort of mental model that's like you're coated in Teflon, and unless you're emotionally opened up to learning before even the cognitive opening, and we know you're supposed to activate relevant knowledge before you provide new knowledge because that helps it stick better. But I think you got to open up people to why they should care even before that. The WIFM, what's in it for me? Why do I care? I believe there's 3 components to learning that are important before you're even willing to commit. And the first one is, well, I need this. And we can make that possible. That we shouldn't be designing courses for people if they don't need it. But if they need it, we should be able to help them understand that with them. But they also need to believe that they don't already know it. And that can be a barrier. People can say, I know how to do sales. Actually, you don't. I know how to do good learning design. Well, maybe if you don't know learning science, you don't. But the third thing is they have to believe also that this experience will change that. And I think as an industry, we've lost that credibility, and we may have to go overboard a bit to reestablish that credibility. But if we really are designing experiences, now we've hooked, if we get all those 3 things right, we've hooked them, but then we've got to deliver on the promise. And that includes having a minimal amount of content that people go, oh, I see how this works. And then you give an example, and we have research from learning science again that says, if you give an example before you immediately start trying to practice, you actually will do better than if you immediately go to practice. You would think that going to practice immediately is going to accelerate you, but it turns out examples help. The right worked examples, at least, where you're showing the underlying thinking behind it. And then practice, they have to recognize the context. It turns out, learning science demonstrated that abstract problems don't transfer well, but realistic problems will transfer. And if people go, oh, that context, I can recognize it. If I could solve that problem, I could solve ones in going forward in the work. And it's got to be pitched at the right level of challenge. But all of that is largely addressing the motivation. And I use the shorthand term emotion and use the term emotion, and that's really, these aren't emotions. But they're not cognitive either. And cognitive science talks about how it's not all cognitive. There's the cognitive, the knowledge, but there's also the affective, who you are as a learner. That's largely immutable. It changes over your lifespan, but it's not really that changing. But the third element is its conation, your intent to do something. I may have a great plan to vacuum the house, but I don't really have the intent. I'm not motivated. Many times it doesn't happen, right? And that's what we're talking about, is that conation. And there's a number of aspects to it. One is your motivation. So I talk about those 3 things to hook you up front, but then you have to deliver on that promise or people's motivational. You want to keep anxiety low. We've talking a lot these days about psychological safety, and that's really important because a little bit of anxiety actually helps performance and learning, but too much and it interferes. And by the way, learning is anxious enough that you don't really need to add any extra. If you need people to perform in stressful environments, absolutely. But first, get them up to doing that skill without the stress, then add in the stress, and they will continue to develop the ability to perform. But if they can't do it before you add the stress, they're not going to be able to do it under stress either. So we got to keep anxiety low for safety. In fact, we want to make it safe for people to make mistakes, because that's where learning happens. You don't want to get it wrong where it matters. You want to get it wrong in the learning environment and get that feedback that will help you remedy it and get it right. So we need to make it safe in that sense. And we want to build people's confidence. I don't want their confidence to be, okay, I was willing to do it in the learning experience. I want them confident to say, I'm willing to give it a go out where it matters. And those, again, aren't really necessarily emotions per se, but they're things we should address and we should develop consciously, that we are thinking about. How are we keeping anxiety low? How are we making sure the challenge is at the right level? It's not, if it's too hard, it's frustrating and learning doesn't happen. If it's too simple, it's boring and learning doesn't happen. And as we develop abilities, we need more and more challenge. And that comes from Csikszentmihalyi's flow or Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. But they both say that. And the important thing is making sure at the right place where the learner is right now that they're being challenged appropriately. And that means finer and finer distinctions they have to make, more and more complex decisions, but eventually you get them to the level where they can perform at the level they need to perform after the learning experience. And then you're done. But we need to consider consciously these elements as components of the learning experience. That's why I love, you're talking for the LXD Guild. LXD stands for Learning Experience Design. That's what I love about LXD is it says it's not just the learning, it's the whole experience, and that includes the emotional aspects as well. That's why I like the term LXD, and I'm happy that you have an LXD Guild.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Clark. I just shortly summarize. I heard you say, that people will learn one when they feel the need to learn. Two, they feel that they don't know it already. They need, right? And third, that that experience is going to change something for them. So if you have that, then you've motivated the learner. But that's just half the battle won. Now you have to deliver on that promise. And if you deliver on that promise, is when learning will be effective. And delivering on that promise would mean you give them opportunities to fail, create a safe learning space where mistakes are okay because one also learns from mistakes. Right. So thanks for that once again. Very well put. I come to my last question now. You would have seen a lot of online courses, I'm sure. What are the mistakes that most of us make when we design online courses? If you could, on top of the mind, a couple of mistakes that you have seen in online courses.
And I'm guilty of these as well. But the first thing is, in theory, a good learning experience should be 80% doing and 20% content. And yet, most of the courses we see, and I do as well, can be 80% content and 20% practice. Now, if people are actually practicing in their life, like you are a practicing instructional designer, you can go away and hear a conference presentation. It can be relevant for you because it's a reflective experience, a chance to step back and think about it, and then you go back into practice and you may modify your ways. And if it's well done conference presentation, but the practice tends to be bad. I believe, and I've stated this explicitly multiple times, that the most important change we could make would be change the practice. If we had people doing meaningful decisions, instead of just reciting knowledge, we're going to have a higher likelihood of them making the meaningful decisions right outside the learning experience. We also tend to have an event, whether it's e-learning or a face-to-face course, and then we're done. And we shouldn't. I remember, because it stuck with me so meaningfully, Celine Schillinger talked about when she was working in a pharmacy organization, and they wouldn't release a course until they'd figured out how it was going to be supported post the course. In other words, manager training, coaching, whatever it was, they wanted to make sure that was in place so all their work didn't immediately get extinguished as soon as they left the learning experience. Those are the big things. Our Serious E-Learning Manifesto tried to really characterize the difference between typical e-learning and what we felt was good e-learning. And it would be, realistic contexts and meaningful decisions and consequences before you get the didactic feedback, doing things that actually matter in performance. We tend to dump knowledge and test that knowledge instead of putting people in situations to use that knowledge and giving them feedback about how well they're doing in developing that ability. That to me continues to be a problem I see, and my continuing campaign is to try and change that ratio, get people hooking people emotionally, getting them doing meaningful things and leaving them transformed in useful ways rather than just dumping information, testing that information, and essentially hoping and praying that that will lead to some change instead of actually engineering it.
Yeah. So I like that part where you said hooking people and making them do something meaningful and getting them transformed. Very, very well summarized that. And that the way to do that is to have people do more and recite less, the 80-20 that you talked about. And also providing performance support after the training or the course is over. So one course is not going to change or develop a certain skill in your learners. There has to be ongoing performance support.
Yeah, and that's why I'm advising a startup called Elevator 9, because they're trying to address this with learning science. There have been a number of attempts I haven't been part of, but this one, because they're actually looking at the learning science behind this, to actually extend those events with just little reactivations over time, but getting people to make changes in their workplace and then evaluate what's working and what isn't. Those sorts of things are important. We don't do enough of that, and we can. There are lots of ways to do it. L.E.A.D is one solution, but just ignoring it isn't a solution. Leaving people to, what's the expression for training, spray and pray? That's not a good model for outcomes.
Yeah. Okay, Clark, thank you very much for joining us on the L.E.A.D podcast, which LXD Guild and ID Mentors are collaborating to bring to India, great minds such as you, and sharing your knowledge, your experiences, your insights with the L&D community in India. Thank you once again for taking out the time for doing this. And that's it.
Thank you. In instructional designing, joining us on the L.E.A.D Podcast Series powered by ID Mentors to share practical and impactful strategies. So stay tuned, listeners, for more insights on learning and development. There is quick news which I would like to share. To all the learning designers, L&D professionals, and lifelong learners, on November 8th of this year, the LXD Guild is bringing India's largest gathering of instructional designers, Learning Without Limits, India Conference in Delhi, and you don't want to miss. So mark your calendars for November 8th at Delhi. So register now on www.lxdguild.com and be part of something extraordinary, because the future of learning isn't coming, it's being designed right here. So until next time, keep learning and keep growing. Thank you.